The last time an Amish family in Lancaster County called a doctor for a cough was sometime around 1847. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody needed to, because by 1848, they had stopped calling entirely. Not because doctors got worse, not because the roads got harder to travel, but because sometime in the mid-1800s, something was passed down in Amish communities that made the trip unnecessary. A syrup. Brown, slightly sweet, smelling of earth and something older than memory. Brewed on a wood stove in a cast iron pot, poured into a mason jar and stored on a shelf next to the dried herbs and the rendered lard. 200 years later, Amish families across Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania still make it. Their kids recover in 2 days. Their grandparents swear by it the way other people swear by nothing, because nothing in their world requires swearing. It just works. Meanwhile, the average American household spends around $300 a year on over-the-counter cough and cold medicine. Products that, in a 2022 FDA Advisory Committee review, were described by researchers as having no more effectiveness than a placebo in many cases. Products whose active ingredient, phenylephrine, was formally declared ineffective for nasal decongestion by the FDA in 2023. $300 a year for something that doesn't work. And the Amish have been sitting quietly in their farmhouses, not spending a single cent, not coughing any longer than they need to, making the same syrup their great-great-grandmothers made in a different century. This is the story of how that happened, how a $1 remedy got buried, and why what the Amish never forgot might be the most important thing you learn this year. To understand the Amish relationship with medicine, you have to understand who the Amish actually are. Not the caricature. Not the tourism brochure version with the bonnets and the horse-drawn buggies. The real version. The Amish trace their religious roots to the Anabaptist movement in 16th century Switzerland. They came to America in the early 1700s, settling first in Pennsylvania, then spreading across Ohio, Indiana, and further west. They brought with them a theological conviction that has shaped every aspect of their lives since. Gelassenheit, the yielding of self to community and to God. What that means practically is a deep skepticism of anything that pulls the individual away from the community. Modern medicine, with its hospitals and specialists and pharmaceutical prescriptions, pulls people away. It centralizes knowledge that, in the Amish worldview, belongs in the home. It creates dependency on institutions outside the community. And it costs money that could feed a family for a month. So the Amish never fully adopted it. They use it selectively. Broken bones, surgeries that cannot wait, genuine emergencies, yes. But for the ordinary illnesses of ordinary life, coughs and colds and fevers and flu, they have always turned first to what they grew and what they made. This is not ignorance. The Amish are not anti-medicine because they don't understand medicine. Many of them understand it quite well. They are selective because they have seen what community-based herbal knowledge can do, and they have watched it work for 200 years while the rest of the country handed that knowledge to corporations. The syrup at the center of this story has several variations across different Amish communities, but the core formula is almost always the same. Onion, raw honey, sometimes ginger, sometimes thyme, occasionally garlic. The proportions shift. The preparation varies slightly from household to household, the way recipes always do when they're passed down by memory and hand, rather than printed and standardized. The most common version works like this. Take a medium yellow onion, slice it thin. Layer the slices into a clean mason jar, alternating with raw, local honey. Fill the jar, seal it loosely. Let it sit at room temperature for 8 to 12 hours. By morning, the onion will have wept its liquid into the honey, and the honey will have wept its antimicrobial compounds back into the onion, and what you will have is a dark amber syrup that smells something like the inside of an old apothecary cabinet. Take a tablespoon every few hours when a cough starts. That's it. That's the whole system. It sounds almost embarrassingly simple. And that simplicity is exactly why it got ignored by an industry that profits from complexity. Here's what the science actually says about this, because there is science, and it does not flatter the pharmaceutical industry. Onions are dense with quercetin, one of the most studied flavonoids in nutritional science. Quercetin has demonstrated antiviral, anti-inflammatory, and antihistamine properties in multiple peer-reviewed studies. A 2016 paper in the journal Nutrients described quercetin as having direct antiviral activity against a range of respiratory viruses, including influenza. A 2020 review published in Frontiers in Immunology documented its capacity to reduce the cytokine storm response that makes respiratory illness so damaging. Quercetin doesn't just fight infection, it calms the body's overreaction to infection, which is often the part that makes you feel destroyed. The fever that climbs too high, the swelling that closes your airway, the inflammation that turns a manageable cold into a week on the couch. Quercetin works on all of those fronts, not by suppressing your immune system, but by moderating its response so it does the job without burning down the house. Raw honey, specifically unprocessed local honey, is a different story with its own remarkable history. Honey has been used as a medicinal substance for roughly 8,000 years. The ancient Egyptians used it to treat wounds. Medieval European physicians kept it in their apothecaries. The World Health Organization, in a 2001 document on management of childhood infections, listed honey as a demulcent, meaning a substance that soothes inflamed mucous membranes. More recently, a 2010 randomized controlled trial published in Pediatrics, one of the most prestigious journals in American medicine, found that buckwheat honey outperformed dextromethorphan, the active cough suppressant in most over-the-counter syrups, in reducing nighttime cough frequency in children. Honey outperformed the pharmaceutical cough suppressant in a peer-reviewed clinical trial, published in one of the most respected medical journals in the country. In 2010, 14 years ago. You probably didn't hear about it. There was no press release from a pharmaceutical brand, no ad campaign. Because honey does not have a marketing budget. Honey cannot be patented. And anything that cannot be patented cannot generate the returns that justify a billion-dollar promotional campaign. To understand why this matters beyond one syrup, you have to understand how the pharmaceutical industry was built. In the early 1900s, American medicine looked very different. The dominant medical tradition was pluralistic. Eclectic physicians worked alongside homeopaths, herbalists, and Thomsonian practitioners. Botanical remedies were widely prescribed. The knowledge of which plant did what and how to prepare it was common knowledge in rural communities across the country. Then came the Flexner Report. In 1910, the Carnegie Foundation commissioned a man named Abraham Flexner to evaluate medical education in the United States. The report he produced was scathing about the quality of many medical schools, which was a fair criticism. But the reforms it prompted went far beyond quality control. Flexner's framework, backed by the Rockefeller Institute and the Carnegie Foundation, effectively standardized American medicine around a single model: pharmaceutical-based treatment, laboratory science, and hospital-centered care. Schools that taught botanical medicine lost their accreditation. Herbal practitioners were increasingly labeled as charlatans. The vast, living body of folk medicine knowledge that had served rural America for generations was systematically delegitimized. It was not a conspiracy in the Hollywood sense. It was not a secret meeting in a darkened room. It was something more mundane and more powerful. It was capital following profit. Pharmaceutical drugs could be patented. Plants could not. Patented drugs generated returns. Plants did not. The entire architecture of incentives pointed away from botanical medicine and toward synthesized proprietary compounds. By mid-century, the American medical system was almost entirely pharmaceutical. The herbal traditions that had been practiced for generations survived only in the margins, in rural communities, in immigrant households, in the homes of people who, by choice or necessity, had stayed outside the system. The Amish were one of those communities. Not because they refused modern medicine entirely, but because their entire way of life was built around self-sufficiency. They grew food, they built houses, they raised children without daycare, and they treated illness with what they had, which was a vast inherited knowledge of which plants did what, passed down person to person, mother to daughter, grandmother to grandchild, for 200 years without interruption. The suppression of botanical medicine was not always passive. There are documented cases throughout the 20th century of government agencies and pharmaceutical interests actively working to discredit herbal practitioners and restrict access to plant-based remedies. Companies selling elderberry extract for immune support received warning letters from the FDA. Herbal practitioners who made specific claims about the efficacy of their products, even claims supported by the available science, were prosecuted for practicing medicine without a license. Meanwhile, the science on many of those same herbal remedies was accumulating quietly in academic journals. Elderberry was studied in clinical trials and found to reduce the duration of influenza illness. Thyme, one of the ingredients in many Amish cough syrups, was the subject of a 2006 German clinical trial that compared a thyme and ivy syrup to the pharmaceutical expectorant ambroxol and found comparable effectiveness. Comparable effectiveness against a patented pharmaceutical drug from a plant you can grow in a pot on your windowsill. The research existed. It continued to exist. It simply did not reach the attention of American consumers because the system designed to translate research into practice had no economic incentive to promote it. Back in Lancaster County, none of this history needed to be explained to anyone. It was simply lived. An Amish grandmother named Miriam, interviewed by a homesteading blogger in 2019, described learning the cough syrup from her own mother this way. "You don't think of it as medicine. You think of it as food that heals. My mother never called it a remedy. She called it something you made. When you are sick, you make it. When you are not sick, you are glad you know how." That framing, food that heals, is actually closer to how ancient and medieval medicine understood the relationship between nutrition and health than anything in the modern pharmaceutical model. The Greek concept of food as medicine, most frequently attributed to Hippocrates, though the original attribution is disputed, was foundational to European medical thought for centuries. The idea that the body healed itself when given the right raw materials, and that plants and foods could provide those materials, was mainstream medicine for most of human history. The pharmaceutical model, which treats the body as a mechanism that breaks and requires a specific chemical intervention to fix, is in historical terms the newcomer. It is roughly a century old. The food as medicine tradition it displaced is thousands of years old. The Amish did not consciously preserve a medical philosophy. They preserved a set of practices. The practices happen to be grounded in a medical philosophy that, when you look at the science, holds up considerably better than the one that replaced it. Let's talk about what else the Amish know, because the cough syrup is one piece of a much larger picture. Amish communities have unusually low rates of several chronic diseases that devastate mainstream American populations. Asthma rates in Amish children are dramatically lower than in the general population, a finding so striking that it attracted the attention of researchers from the University of Arizona, who published a study in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2016. The researchers found that Amish children, who grow up on traditional farms with raw milk and regular exposure to farm animals and soil, had immune systems that were essentially pre-trained against allergic and inflammatory responses. Their exposure to a diverse microbial environment in early childhood appeared to calibrate their immune systems in ways that prevented the overreaction patterns underlying asthma and allergies. Obesity rates in Amish communities are a fraction of national averages. Type 2 diabetes is relatively rare. Cardiovascular disease rates are lower. Studies have attributed much of this to physical labor and diet. But researchers have also pointed to fermented foods, raw dairy, and garden-to-table eating habits that are standard in Amish homes and increasingly understood by nutritional science as genuinely protective. None of this is magic. None of it requires believing anything mystical about Amish life. It is the product of 200 years of living in a specific way, a way that prioritizes whole food, physical labor, community, and a knowledge of how to care for the body using what the land provides. The cough syrup works because the ingredients work. Let's go deeper on that, because understanding the mechanism is what separates this from folk myth. Quercetin from onion acts as a natural antihistamine reducing the histamine response that causes much of the swelling and mucus overproduction in upper respiratory illness. It inhibits mast cell degranulation, which is the process by which your immune system releases the chemical signals that make your throat swell and your nose run. This is the same mechanism targeted by pharmaceutical antihistamines, but without the drowsiness, the dry mouth, or the urinary retention that come with most first-generation antihistamine drugs. Sulfur compounds in onion, particularly allyl propyl disulfide and dipropyl disulfide, have demonstrated antimicrobial activity in laboratory studies. They are not as potent as pharmaceutical antivirals, but they are also not contributing to the liver stress and drug resistance issues that accompany pharmaceutical antiviral use over time. Raw honey's antimicrobial properties come from multiple mechanisms working at once. Hydrogen peroxide production from glucose oxidase enzyme activity. High osmolarity that dehydrates and kills bacterial cells. B-defensin 1, an antimicrobial peptide unique to honey. And a low pH that creates an environment hostile to many pathogens. These mechanisms work synergistically, meaning they reinforce each other, which is why pathogens have not developed resistance to honey the way they have developed resistance to antibiotics. You cannot become resistant to multiple simultaneous mechanisms of attack. The demulcent effect of honey is equally important and often overlooked. A demulcent coats and soothes inflamed mucous membranes. This is why honey is effective against cough specifically. It physically soothes the irritated tissue that is triggering the cough reflex, giving the membrane a chance to begin healing. No pharmaceutical cough suppressant works this way. They work centrally, meaning they suppress the neurological signal in the brain that produces the cough, without addressing the underlying tissue irritation. This is like turning off a smoke alarm instead of putting out the fire. When you add ginger to the syrup, you add gingerols and shogals, compounds with demonstrated anti-inflammatory and anti-nausea effects. When you add thyme, you add thymol and carvacrol, antimicrobial compounds so effective that they are used as active ingredients in some commercial mouthwash formulations. When you add garlic, you add allicin, arguably the most studied natural antimicrobial compound in existence, with documented activity against influenza viruses, rhinoviruses, and a broad range of bacteria. The Amish were not running clinical trials. They were not reading journal articles. They were watching what worked and passing it down. And what they passed down happens to be, from a pharmacological standpoint, a remarkably sophisticated multi-mechanism respiratory remedy built entirely from ingredients that cost less than a cup of coffee. Here is how to make it. This is the version most commonly cited in Amish recipe collections and documented in homesteading communities that have learned it from Amish neighbors over generations. Take one large yellow onion, peel it and slice it as thin as you can manage. Thin slices release more quercetin and more of the sulfur compounds. Take half a cup of raw local honey, not pasteurized grocery store honey, raw honey, preferably local, because local raw honey contains pollen from plants in your specific environment, which has additional immune modulating benefits. If you cannot source local raw honey, any raw, unpasteurized honey from a health food store is the next best option. If you have fresh ginger, slice about an inch of root into thin coins. If you have dried thyme, a tablespoon is enough. If you have fresh garlic, 2 to 3 cloves sliced thin will add significant antimicrobial strength. None of the additions are required. The base of onion and honey is sufficient on its own. The additions deepen the effect. Layer the onion slices and any additional ingredients in a clean mason jar. Pour the honey over everything. The honey should fill the jar and cover all the ingredients completely. Place a lid on it loosely, not airtight, just rest it on top, and leave it at room temperature for 8 to 12 hours. The osmotic pressure of the honey draws the liquid out of the onion, dilutes the honey slightly, and creates a syrup saturated with the active compounds from every ingredient. After 12 hours, the syrup can be strained or left with the ingredients intact. Both work. Strained is cleaner to take by spoon. Unstrained continues to develop in flavor and potency for the first few days. It keeps at room temperature for about a week. In the refrigerator, it keeps for about a month. In a household with children, it rarely lasts that long. The dosage is 1 tablespoon every 3 to 4 hours for adults at the onset of a cough or cold. 1 teaspoon every 4 hours for children over 12 months of age. Do not give honey to children under 12 months because of the documented risk of infant botulism. The total cost of ingredients, depending on where you source them, falls somewhere between 70 cents and $1.50. One batch makes enough syrup for an adult to use through a typical cold from first symptom to recovery. $1. Against $300 a year in products the FDA's own advisory committee described as no more effective than placebo. There is a version of this story that ends with outrage, with accusations and pointed fingers, and a clean narrative villain. The pharmaceutical industry deliberately buried this. And while there is genuine truth in the incentive structure that story describes, the more accurate version is quieter and more systemic. Nobody buried the onion honey syrup in a boardroom. No executive signed a memo ordering the suppression of quercetin research. What happened was more passive and more total. A system was built that rewarded the development and sale of patented compounds. That system attracted capital, talent, and regulatory influence. It defined what counted as medicine and what counted as folk remedy. It shaped medical education, hospital practice, and the conversations between doctors and patients for 100 years. Within that system, onion honey syrup was simply invisible. Not suppressed, invisible. It could not be studied on the scale required to generate FDA approval, because no company would fund studies for something nobody could patent. It could not be recommended by physicians because no physician was trained in it. It could not be marketed because there was nothing proprietary about it. It existed outside the map. And the Amish existed outside the map. By deliberate theological and social choice, they have always lived outside the map of mainstream American consumer culture. They did not adopt the pharmaceutical model, not because they were backward, but because their community life was structured in a way that never required it. They had the recipe. They had the herbs. They had 200 years of observational data that said this works. The rest of us handed the map to corporations and then forgot we had ever known how to navigate without one. The homesteading movement, that has grown significantly in the last decade, is in many ways an attempt to recover that navigation knowledge. People learning to grow food, to preserve it, to treat minor illness with kitchen remedies, to live closer to the cycles of land and season. The Amish have become, somewhat ironically, cultural touchstones for this movement, held up not as something to imitate wholesale, but as evidence that another way is possible. That the knowledge required to sustain a household without constant dependence on industrial systems is learnable and livable. The cough syrup is one thread in that tapestry. It is not the most important thing you could learn from Amish practice, but it is concrete and immediate. You can make it tonight. You can have it on the shelf by tomorrow morning. You can give it to your child the next time a cough wakes them at 2 in the morning and know, with the backing of 200 years of community practice and a growing body of peer-reviewed science, that you are doing something that works. That is not a small thing. In a world where people feel increasingly helpless in the face of systems designed to extract money and keep them dependent, the ability to pull a jar off a shelf and say, I made this, I know what's in it, I know why it works, and it cost me $1. That is a form of sovereignty. Small sovereignty, but real. The pharmaceutical industry will not collapse because of onion honey syrup. Modern medicine has genuine achievements to its name. Surgical technique, vaccine development, emergency trauma care, the treatment of bacterial infections. These save millions of lives, and botanical medicine cannot replace them. Nobody is suggesting you treat appendicitis with thyme. But the specific category of over-the-counter cough and cold medicine, an $18 billion annual market in the United States alone, is where the evidence most clearly favors the traditional remedy. The FDA has already acknowledged that the primary active ingredient in most oral decongestants doesn't work. The clinical literature on honey versus dextromethorphan is not ambiguous. The quercetin research is not fringe science. The information is there. The Amish knew it 200 years ago. The research has caught up. What remains is simply the choice to use it, and the willingness to reclaim the knowledge that was quietly moved out of your kitchen and into a corporate supply chain sometime in the middle of the last century. There is a woman in Holmes County, Ohio, who has been making this syrup for 61 years. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers, in a chain of transmission that goes back beyond living memory. When a local journalist asked her if she had ever tried a store-bought cough syrup, she thought about it and said, "Once, when I was about 30 and we couldn't find the honey, it didn't taste right, and it didn't work as well." She is not a scientist. She is not making a political argument. She is not trying to sell you anything. She is a woman who has had 61 years of direct observational data on two different approaches to the same problem, and she has a clear conclusion. The jar on your shelf doesn't care about market share. The honey doesn't know it's supposed to be a folk remedy. The onion doesn't have a PR problem. They just do what they have always done, which is work, quietly and reliably, for anyone patient enough to let them sit overnight and smart enough to reach for the jar before the receipt. 200 years of Amish families, and not one of them ever needed to buy a single bottle of Robitussin. That's the whole story, and the whole recipe. Make the syrup.